Good evening. It's good to be back with you tonight. If you have a Bible or a device, you know where we're headed. I'd love for you to turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 14. 1 Samuel chapter 14. We are continuing in our textual survey of the books of 1 and 2 Samuel out of the Old Testament. And again, just as the way of review, if you've been here with us, you know that this is right at the end of the period of the judges, beginning of the period of the kings, not necessarily by God's design, but this is what they continue to ask for. Chapter 12 gives us the farewell address of Samuel. We looked last week at Saul fighting the Philistines, and we see some of the things that Saul already began to do that deviated from the plan and the law of God, and we're going to see that even more tonight. Chapter 14 really highlights one of my favorite Old Testament men that we have for us. That's Jonathan. The relationship David and Jonathan have is really, it's one of the more beautiful highlights of godly friendship, but it really goes even beyond that. I mean, the language in the Hebrew, they talk to each other and they consider each other to be brothers. I mean, they're that close. Right, but what we see that they do, because Jonathan's placed right in the middle, right? A great friend in David, but his father Saul is king. And as we saw last week in chapter 13, God is going to tell Saul, right, your son's not going to become king, right? The lineage of you is going to stop here. We know that he's going to begin to prepare David to become king. And what's interesting about that is Jonathan still wants to befriend David and still has a pretty good amount of time between when Saul finally is taken away and David becomes king. But we're going to look in chapter 14, and in many ways, this is one of the great chapters of Jonathan. You're going to see kind of two leadership styles, for lack of a better phrase, but certainly two faiths and how they're going about it. Remember, they're butting up against the Philistine army. We looked last week at, if you go back just a few verses, just to prime our minds, because this is going to come back tonight, 19, 20 through the end of the chapter. Basically, God had allowed the Philistines to have not only the numerical advantage men-wise, but they really had the advantage technology-wise. Remember, except for the officers that Israel didn't have swords and battle equipment. They basically had farming utensils that they sharpened, whereas the Philistines had a great weaponry. And again, this was God giving Israel into the Philistines' hands because of Israel's disobedience. But Jonathan's going to come and offer us a glimpse of hope in chapter 14. And what's interesting, we'll look in chapter 14. We'll do like we've done, but this is a long chapter, one of the longest chapters in the Old Testament, right? We're going to look at 52 verses, but we don't have time for that. We're good to get half of that normally. So we're going to omit some stuff. We're going to read down through, and we're going to kind of take it. Instead of reading all of this, we're going to just read it chunk by chunk and kind of go about it that way, because we're going to try to read somewhere in the ballpark of about 30 to 35 verses of the 52. So the lion's share, but we won't get it all. All right, let's start in verse 1. And I want you to just notice how this chapter starts. I love the language here. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor. Now, having an armor bearer was standard practice, certainly for people in Jonathan's position. They all had, this was a coveted job. You were right with the upper echelon and this was not just to Israel, right? That was cultural, across the board, armor bearers were used. So you were in the upper echelon of leadership, but it was kind of a dangerous job, and it had a lot of responsibility around it. You're basically have the king's safety as part of this. What I want you to highlight in this is really the first two words. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul. What that tells me, maybe you've read, kind of inferred this as well, is that what's about to happen here, Jonathan didn't wake up realizing something big is happening today, right? What this really is a story of consistent faith in spite of the circumstances around you, right? Everything on paper would tell Jonathan, God's not showing up, right? The Philistines are camping outside. We have such a small army by comparison, but it highlights for us the necessity of staying faithful and God utilizing men such as Jonathan when we least expect it. Because God stays faithful. God has a plan, all that far outweighs ours. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. We're going to read the first 3 verses here. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ajai, the son of Atub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Again, it happened one day at the beginning. There was nothing that should have indicated that this day was going to be remarkable. But God would win a great victory through bold trust and faith in God's provision. And again, we look at stories like this and we think, man, God interacted with his people in a unique way at that point. I mean, again, we're still very much dealing with, you've got Samuel living, who is a prophet that is speaking directly from God. So there's some nuance here, I understand that. But I think there's some application here of, many times we pray and we ask for God to intervene and we keep waiting and thinking, God, is today going to be the day? Are you going to act? Are you going to do? And then you've got a situation here like Jonathan, who he woke up like any other day, but God says, I've got a bigger plan, and I'm going to use you today. And they win this great victory. Let us go to the Philistines' garrison. Again, the Israelites were in this military conflict, and the win here must have seemed impossible, certainly by comparison. If we had a lot of time, we'd look at the historical might of the Philistine army. It was overwhelming. I mean, they were a world superpower, certainly as far as Israel's concerned. They were vastly outnumbered. They were greatly overworked in terms of military technology. But Jonathan was bold enough to go over to a Philistine garrison. And the way I kept thinking about that was, Jonathan seemed to me to want to do this just to see what God might do. To have the faith to say, wouldn't God show up today? Why would God is on our side? Why would he not? Again, if you go back to Judges chapter 3, I don't know this, but I kept thinking of Shamgar in Judges chapter 3, right? Shamgar won a victory over 600 Philistines with just a sharp stick, right? A story that Jonathan probably would have been familiar with. If God can do it through Shamgar, what could he do through me? And we're going to see that he's going to do a tremendous work through Jonathan. He didn't tell his dad, and again, was this an oversight? Was it something more to be explained? But in reality, it was probably him going out and doing what he had always done. He believed, his dad probably would have said no, and so he goes out on faith anyway. And then you get kind of the contrast here. Go back to verse 2. I'd encourage you to highlight this as well. Saul was staying in the outskirts in the pomegranate caves. Right? Saul was basically sitting on his behind waiting for all of this to transpire. And Jonathan, by contrast, says, I'm done waiting. Right? We have God on our side. What are we doing? And he's going to go out and he's going to win this victory. What's interesting, we look through kind of this lineage and you might think this was purely from another commentator. I wouldn't have made this connection. But if you look through this and it starts mentioning Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh. What's interesting about this is the relationship to Ichabod, right? That name means the glory has departed. So what they're really saying is the men that are with Saul are the ones who God's left that camp. Saul's still king, but Saul's left. But God's really removed from Saul. He's already began to work up in David. And I'd suggest to you, God does a tremendous work through Jonathan, in spite of the fact that Saul was the one anointed to be king. And what's interesting at the end of this is it says the people did not know that Jonathan was gone. It tells me one thing. Jonathan didn't do this for personal glory. Nobody even knew he was gone. That he wasn't making a big thing of, I'm going to go defeat the Philistines, I'm going to go to this garrison, I'm going to do A, B, and C. It was between him his people and a faith in God. And that's usually when God shows up, when it doesn't become about us. And you're going to see here in a moment, Saul is going to do what Saul always does, which is, I'm going to try to make it about me. My win, my victory, and Saul is going to royally mess things up again. Right? God is providing, God's going to provide for Israel, but Saul is going to go out in left field and put a curse essentially on the people, something he didn't have the right to do. And then his own son is going to be the one that, unknowing to Jonathan, but he's going to fall victim to this. This whole chapter 14 is so interesting. Again, read all of this in its entirety at home. The narrative is incredible. It's just too long for us to do in one sitting. All right, let's keep reading. 4 and 5. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of one was Bozez and the other was Sinah. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. Now again, this is basically Jonathan finding this strategic pass that, they're going to funnel the Philistines into this spot, which is way more easily defendable. And again, you look at the difference here. What's the difference between Saul and what Jonathan is doing? Again, does Jonathan have any assurances that God is going to show up? He doesn't. But he's going out in faith to say, I believe God can. I believe on any given day, God can. Why not today? That's an interesting thought exercise that, again, very different than his father, who's sitting, waiting. And we're going to see the difference in how God views this. So 6 and 7, Jonathan's going to make a proposal. Jonathan said to this young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. Notice what he said there. It may be that the Lord work for us. He had no guarantees that God was going to show up, but he was willing to act anyway. Friends, when was the last time we stepped out with even a fraction of that faith? It may be that God will show up. But Jonathan understood that there was a reality where it was not within the will of God for them to win that day, that they could die. But he was willing to go anyway. Come, let us go to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. And I love what he follows it with. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. What he meant is the only thing that can, quote unquote, hinder what God is capable of is you and I as the earthen vessels that are supposed to work within the plan of God. When we limit God by the lack of faith that we have, but he's saying, as far as what God's concerned, nothing can hinder him from saving by many or saving by few. And his armor bearer said, do all that is in your heart, do as you wish. Behold, I am with you heart and with soul. Jonathan knew that the need was great. He knew that Israel was backed into a corner. He was hopelessly outnumbered. They were demoralized. But Jonathan also believed that God wanted to use somebody. And his dad wasn't cutting it. His dad was sitting under the pomegranate trees in the caves. Something had to be done, and Jonathan was willing to be the man. Not for the glory. Again, nobody even knew he was gone. Then why act? Because he believed God had a bigger plan, and he wanted to be a part of it. Again, are there nuances in the Old Testament that make this a very unique case, a unique story in a unique period of time? Yeah. But broaden, go back 30,000 foot view. If we look at this and say, do we believe God still has a plan today? I hope we all believe that. Do you want to play a part in that plan? Again, I hope the answer is yes. Then I'll suggest to you that Jonathan gives us far better an example than Saul ever did. Now, Saul's going to go on to win some battles, and Saul's going to do some more good things, and Saul's not completely off the rails yet. But I love the heart of Jonathan. My God's got a plan. Whether he shows up today or not, I believe my God has a plan. For nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. The phrase that I wrote in my outline is, what wise courage, when it probably wasn't advised on paper. But he said, my God's bigger than what's on paper. Jonathan's faith was demonstrated by his works. We keep going down to 8 through 10. Then Jonathan said, behold, we will cross over to the men and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and we will not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be a sign to us. Again, Jonathan, his armor bearer, was all on board. He says, great, let's go and see if, again, this is a step of faith. And you know, there's some difference here there's a few instances throughout Scripture where people are given signs by God to do things. But what makes Jonathan's really unique here is there was really no preamble to make him think that God is going to show up in this miraculous way. Right, you know, if you think back to, you know, Judges chapter 6, the story you're familiar with, Gideon setting out the fleece, right? I mean, that was very much to know whether God was here or not. But he had been told by God to do this, right? And so there was already some kind of built-in confirmation, and he's just waiting to see the results. Jonathan's completely opposite in many ways, right? Has no idea if God is going to show up or not, right? God may or he may not, but he showed wisdom, not unbelief, right? To the point, he doesn't act on a specific confirmed word from God. Instead, he had hope, he had trust, but he was also humble enough to recognize that his heart and mind might be wrong on that day. And he says, God, please guide my steps. If you're here, show me. Again, a beautiful testament of faith and wisdom and trust from a very young man that's coming before God. And God's going to do incredible things through Jonathan. 11 through 14, Jonathan and his armor bearer attack. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden. And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and his feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike, which Jonathan, his armor bearer, made, killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length in the arc of the land. Again, Jonathan at no point tries to point this back to him. Look at my great achievements, right? The Lord has given them into our hands today. He climbed up, and again, must have been a difficult climb, right? I mean, they've come up to this defensible position, and now they're climbing up on top of it to find the Philistines there. And you know, the temptation would have been, God, you know, why don't you bring them down to us? Why don't you make it easier on us? But Jonathan does. There's so many lessons to be learned here, right? There's the faith that we have, but then there's the works that accompany that. There's the trust, the part that we have to contribute. And Jonathan does a tremendous job setting that example for us, right? I believe God can be and can do exactly what we need him to do, but we have to be his hands and feet to go and do it. And Jonathan says, I'll climb up on top of that, right? Lord, if you'll just show us the sign, we'll do the grunt work. We'll do what you ask us to do. And they fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer. Again, Jonathan saw that the confirming sign from God. But you know, he didn't wait for God to handle it. He says, today we're going to win. And he goes and they strike him down. Then we get to verse 15. And I want you to highlight this one particularly because this is where God really shows up. You know, God has affirmed that he's here and he's on their side, and that's all they needed to move forward. But 15 is where God takes it to another level. There was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Again, almost 100% certainty that this was God inflicting panic on this camp. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. It didn't matter if the Philistines greatly outnumbered the Israelites. It didn't matter that they had better weapons. God was more than capable to set the Philistines against each other. Had the Israelites had no swords, God would have had the provision to still accomplish his goal here. You know, we look through this, and again, we know, we wait for God to do what we can do, but God often, again, wants us to be that initiating force, and then God circles back around, again, does what only God could have done, which was to send an earthquake to put panic in the camp. He alone can do what he can do. Now, we're going to skip 16 through 19, right? This is Saul learning of the battle. He's learning what Jonathan had done. We're going to skip through that. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but basically Saul does two really worthless things that makes himself look more spiritual, but is really not. Right? At one point in this, he's going to call roll. He's going to call roll to try to see who all's there. Again, at that moment was really worthless. Saul, what he should have done was immediately jumped into the fight. He knows that God is with him. He's king. He should have jumped in to fight, but he didn't. That was a strategic moment that Israel could have pounced, and he didn't. Again, he was probably more worried about who was leading in battle, who was going to get the credit. Jonathan was already there, so in his eyes, why bother? Again, why Saul was a not great king, and why Jonathan, at much younger an age, had way more spiritual wisdom. And then he asks that the ark get brought, right? Again, another thing useless at the moment. This is probably posturing on Saul's part, to look spiritual, right? To be in the proximity of the ark. But at that moment, there was nothing to seek God about, right? There was a time to go and pray and ask for God's provision, and then there's time to act. This moment was acting, right? God has already shown Jonathan through faith. Now, Saul didn't necessarily know that, but he had already shown Jonathan, I'm here and I'm ready, and let's make a decisive victory. And Saul misses it. But then we're going to pick up in verse 20. And again, like I said, for many years left to come, Saul is going to be an up and down story, right? Not a complete write-off, but not a great king either. But we're going to see him take his lumps. Starting in verse 20, let's look at this. So Saul is finally going to enter into battle. After, we don't know quite the amount of time that had transpired, but Jonathan clearly got the ball rolling. Saul's going to hear about it, try to posture to make himself look like he's the big guy and asking for God's provision, and then he's finally going to jump in. Starting in verse 20, read down through verse 23. Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle, and behold, every Philistine sword was against the fellow, and there was great confusion. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time and who had gone up with them into camp, even as they had turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan, likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in battle. But notice verse 23, but the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth-aven. Saul was the leader of Israel. It was time for him to step up and start leading, and eventually he did. But again, Jonathan, the real opportunity would have been if Saul had done what Jonathan did. But that's not Saul's character. Again, Saul is the people's king. He's not God's king. We're going to skip over verse 24, just again for the sake of time. Saul compels the army. It is worth noting in the grander narrative, Saul is going to compel these people to take an oath. Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, right? He's wanting to take vengeance on his enemies. Cursed is the man. But the problem with this is, again, Saul's authority is wrong, right? He's proclaiming this, not God. Saul continues to miss this over and over. He didn't have the authority to proclaim this, but he's going to bind it on Israel. Here in a minute, God is going to supernaturally send honey down for the army to have and to eat and to give themselves energy as they go back into battle, but they couldn't eat it because Saul had put this ridiculous oath on these people. Again, Saul was misguided. He was heavy-handed. Cursed is the man. And again, if Saul had wanted to do a voluntary fast, right? Pull to God. We've done a lesson on fasting not that long ago. Fasting is a good thing, but he didn't have the right to bind it on the nation of Israel, and he did. And they're going to suffer consequence for it. Now, verse 25 through verse 30. I was going to read that. We won't, for the sake of time, we won't read that. For 25 through 30, Jonathan didn't know this oath existed. Remember, he's on the front lines. He's actually doing something. Ironic that he's going to be the one that's going to break the oath that his father isn't authorized to make because he's the one that goes out in faith and is doing what God wants him to do, right? But it tells us that honey was dripping and everyone feared the oath, but Jonathan hadn't heard this. It tells us explicitly he hadn't heard his father had charged them with this, and so he went down and dipped it into the honeycomb. And it tells us it worked, right? He put it to his mouth and his countenance or his constitution brightened. That was God's plan. The irony of the fact that God provided for his people, but because man interfered, they couldn't take the blessing. That is a lesson in and of itself. Again, provision from God. The Israelite army was in hot pursuit of the Philistines. They were tired and they were hungry. But Jonathan broke this. Now we'll go down to verse 31. The soldiers of Israel sin because of Saul's foolish command. Again, for the sake of time, we won't read that. We're going to jump right towards the end here. But Saul begins to bind on them rules that he's created. Right, and it's going to put Israel, it's going to put the army, it's going to put all of God's people in a really tough spot. Right? Then we'll read really quickly. And the people rushed on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate with the blood. You remember, that was against the law of God. They should have bled these animals, and they didn't. Right? And so now everybody, this whole army is sinning because of this, right? And they told Saul, look, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating the blood. And he said, you have dealt treacherously. Disperse yourself among the people and say, bring me here every man's ox and sheep and slaughter and eat and do not sin against the Lord. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 12 tells us this was against God's law that he had put out. And the irony of the fact that he is binding on the nation of Israel things that he shouldn't have, right? And it's ultimately going to cause more sin, right? That they're not going to be able to participate in things that God has provided. Again, Saul blamed the people for what was really his own fault, right? Had he not done the things that he had done, slaughter them here and eat and do not sin. They set up an altar, they begin to do it right. Again, Saul is this oscillation of good and bad. If you read, as we read through this, if you follow along with us, you're going to continually see good decision immediately followed by bad decision. And then he'll have another good one, and then he'll have another bad one. They're not always perfectly in succession, but most of his life, that's what's recorded for us. 36 through 39, we won't read for the sake of time. Again, Saul is getting antsy because now God has not spoken back, right? So he's going to make another oath. He doesn't learn the first time, makes another oath that he isn't in the right to make. He asks for the counsel of God. This was good, right? But he says, and again, in this, he essentially condemns Jonathan. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it may be in Jonathan my son, he will surely die. Right? Go read all of this. He's making an oath that whoever was the one that committed the infraction, right? And Jonathan was the guy. He says, let him die. Even if it's Jonathan, let him die. I'm sure as he said that, he didn't know that Jonathan was literally the guy. Now, again, that's my inference. I can't imagine. Saul's too prideful to let his own son die that way. I don't think Saul knew at that moment, or I don't think he'd have mentioned him by name. But that's what happens. 40 through 44, they're going to cast lots. We're not going to read that for the sake of time. They're going to cast lots to ultimately decide. They're going to do it by groups. And Saul and Jonathan are going to be found to be in the guilty party. Jonathan was taken. Saul was visibly shaken. He had pronounced death on whoever ate in violation, again, not realizing that it had been Jonathan that did it. But let's read 45 and 46 together. And then the people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair on his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. For the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die." And Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. Jonathan's bold faith in God had way more to do with victory that day than Saul's foolishness, right? The people saw this, and they said, Jonathan cannot die, right? It would be a shame. It would be a travesty to let Jonathan die. Essentially, and here's the irony, the great inference, is that they're basically, if you read between the lines, blaming Saul, right? Now, they're not quite saying it that way, but they're basically saying, he can't die. He's the one who's following God. He's the one who's winning, right? He's only in infraction because of your silly oaths, king. We won't let him die. And that's exactly what happens. And then we end out the chapter 47 through 52. Again, talks about the lineage of Saul, which is great. Again, when Saul had taken over kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side. And it lists all these enemies, ones you know of well, the Moabites, the Ammonites against Edom, the Edomites, and all these other enemies, right? He did valiantly and struck the Amalekites and delivered Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. And then it lists his children. In verse 52, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. Again, that's going to lead us up to David, right? Remember the story you probably most know of David. David and Goliath is a conflict with the Philistines. That is going to be a constant theme for Saul and even to some degree David. And when Saul saw any strong man or valiant man, he attached him to himself. As we wrap up tonight, two lessons I see out of, ironically, only 2 out of 52 verses of chapter 14. But I see 2 things. One, faith acts even when resources are limited. Faith will win the day. Now again, I say this a lot, and I hope that it resonates with you. God's not a genie. God is not going to grant every request we make. And that's the great truth of Jonathan. He knew that. God may not show up today, but I would rather die in faith to the God that is actually king than live under this pseudo-king that my dad is, right? I'd rather go win on God's terms. I'd rather die rather on God's terms than win on Saul's, is basically what he said. Faith acts even when resources are limited. Again, I love 1 Samuel 14:6. It's one I have highlighted in my Bible. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. We should think about that every day of our lives. We go out into the world, nothing can hinder the Lord. And number 2 is that courage is courageous. Biblical courage is courageous. Again, Jonathan inspired his armor bearer. Later, the entire Israelite army, to some degree, his own father, the king, was sitting very safely by in his little cave until he heard of Jonathan's victory. And then even after, him and hawing around, he finally got up the motivation to come and fight. But guarantee this, it would not have happened without Jonathan. I feel 100% certain, had Jonathan not instigated it, Saul wouldn't have. Or certainly not in the way that Jonathan did, right? Saul was continually waiting. God, show me, hand me the victory. And God says, it doesn't always work that way, right? I'll affirm for you that I'm here. That's what he did for Jonathan. But Jonathan was ready to go no matter what. Saul was not. Are we more like Saul or are we more like Jonathan? I hope we're like Jonathan. But the reality is sometimes we are Saul. And I hope that we challenge our faith and our trust in those moments. Tonight, if you aren't a Christian, every time we come together, we want to extend that invitation to you. There is no greater display of trust and faith in the walk of a Christian, of a prospective Christian, than to go into the waters of baptism, recognizing your need for a Savior and trusting that the old you will die. Scripture tells us that that'll happen, and then we come up a new creature. If that's your need tonight, we'd love to help you with it. If we could pray for you in any way, we'd like to help you with that too. Come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together.